I hope you don't have lunch plans, because I started praying this morning, because that's what we're supposed to do, and I started writing down some reflections, and they didn't stop. And normally I would say, well, that's just too much. But today is not a normal day. Today is the 9th anniversary of my ordination, so I am going to take that and use that as an excuse to preach to you for way too long for a daily homily. And the sort of crux of my reflection is this little phrase that I have repeated over and over again over these last 9 years. I didn't sign up for this. And it came several times that I know, like I can remember very vividly. The first time that sort of came to me was during my first years as a priest, trying to figure out what in the world was going on. Every time I did something, it was new, and so I had to sit there and study and figure out how exactly you celebrate a wedding. Because believe it or not, we may have gone over it in seminary. In fact, I'm sure we probably did, but not enough to actually know what we were doing. Every time I had to baptize, I had to read the book, and okay, this is what I do. I flip here, I do that, I put this oil, I put this different oil. It's a lot. And so I had to figure it all out on top of being here at Wisdom, which is not a normal parish, and having to deal with all of the craziness that goes with being around college students all day long. Right? This is the only parish that I'm aware of where your people are with you all day, every day. It's a challenge at times, but more so it is a great blessing. And so I remember thinking that early on. I didn't sign up for this. I remember probably the most vivid time that I thought this was in the summer of 2018. So you might remember the summer of 2018 was the reemergence of the sex abuse scandal. And so I remember very, very clearly sitting on the back porch of St. Edmund's Rectory, because that's where I was living that summer, and thinking, I did not sign up for this. And pretty much immediately upon thinking that, I didn't hear an audible voice, but I just knew that the Lord was telling me, yes, you did. Yes, you did. This is exactly what you signed up for. So I said, okay, Lord, all right, I get it. It didn't make it much easier, but it made it possible. The third time, distinctly remember thinking this, was actually not too long ago. And it actually wasn't just one little sort of moment, but maybe a little drawn-out period that may be continuing now. I don't know. There's no way to tell. But I thought this again recently, right? I didn't sign up for this. And the temptation was to think I was living a great life in this quaint little town called Church Point with wonderful people and cows, lots and lots of cows. And I was just loving it. And one day, the bishop called and said, Father Broussard, he probably called me Patrick, let's be honest. Patrick, I want you to go to Wisdom. I said, Bishop, if you think, because then he said, okay, they're doing the building project, do all this stuff. I said, Bishop, if you think I can do it, great. Here I am. Apparently he thinks I can do it. And so there have been a lot of ups and downs over the last almost 2 years. There have been many struggles, some of my own making. Let's list a few of those. So when I got to Wisdom, the number one rule of being a pastor is you don't make serious changes in your first year. I know this. I was told this over and over and over again in seminary. When I got to Church Point, I told the people that I was not supposed to make any major changes my first year, and I don't think I did. But for some reason, I had this delightful experience of amnesia, I guess, And I made changes too quickly whenever I got to wisdom, and that brought on suffering for myself. That might not have been that bad, but another critical fault that I made was that I did not communicate said changes very well, or perhaps at all. And it turns out that when you change things that could upset people and you don't communicate them well, those two things don't go well together. Unless you're trying to make your life miserable, then they go together very well. And so I did not communicate very well. And then the third thing that perhaps I did to myself, but I think in some ways you have to do, is I got lost in the weeds the first year. I felt like I had to be in everything because I had no idea what I was doing. And so I was in meetings that I probably didn't need to be in. I was dealing with things I probably didn't need to deal with. But part of knowing that you don't need to deal with them is dealing with them the first time. And so I brought some suffering on myself the first year because of that. But then some things were not my fault. And I will list a couple of those also. One is that whenever I arrived here, there was still something of a global pandemic going on. And being on a college campus, those things were heightened a bit. And I will just leave that at that. The second thing that was out of my control was the result of a very good thing, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. But then we had some protests that happened after that, and some things happened, and that was also perhaps, in a lot of ways, out of my control. And then the third thing is that, as I mentioned, when the bishop called me to tell me that he was going to send me here, he mentioned the fact that for, the past 10 years or so, Wisdom and the diocese and the university have been trying to work out a way for Wisdom to have a new home. And so this was going to come to me as the pastor to be able to work on this. And so I have this monster of a building project, which another priest alerted me is probably the largest building project that has ever happened in the diocese. Which I feel very prepared for. Because when I was... No, I'm serious. When I was in Church Point, we had a chapel, and I wanted to open up 24-hour adoration, but there was no bathroom in the chapel. And so I had a bathroom installed. So I feel like I learned pretty much everything I would need for this project during that process. But with this process in particular, lately things have been somewhat difficult. As you can imagine, a project of this size, there's a lot of different people involved and a lot of personalities. And one of those people is me with my personality, so you can imagine how difficult it is. And there's a lot of complexities. Yeah, that's a lot. But there was, doggone it, I should have written this down. There's one other thing that is stressful about the project. Oh yeah, we have to pay for it. We have to pay for it. And so that is a bit of a struggle because I don't know if you know this about me, but I don't have $30 million to pay for it just yet. So, again, the thought creeps into my mind, and I want to say, I didn't sign up for this. But that's not completely true because, as I mentioned in 2018 in particular, there was a moment of grace where immediately upon thinking that, the Lord reminded me that I did. Because I, literally wrote and signed a letter to the bishop asking to be ordained a priest. And part of that rite of ordination is that I laid down with 3 of my other classmates on the floor of the cathedral, symbolic of the fact that I was laying down everything. I was offering my life at the service of Christ and His church. And so to follow Christ means that I will endure suffering. And this is even very explicitly put in the rite of ordination. I actually quoted this a couple weeks ago in my Sunday homily. After the priest is ordained, the gifts are presented to him that he will then offer to God for the holy sacrifice. And these are the words that the bishop says to the priest. Accept from the holy people of God the gifts to be offered to him. Know what you are doing, imitate the mystery you celebrate, and model your life on the mystery of the Lord's cross. So again, I absolutely signed up for everything that is involved, all of the suffering that is involved in being a priest, because I am to be another Christ, and Christ, as we might remember from our catechism class, ended his life by being crucified. And so if I'm going to be another Christ, then I have to be willing to be crucified. Now, if I stopped here, that might be super depressing. It might still be depressing when I'm finished, but I'm going to try to make it less depressing. I remember very clearly a rector at the seminary saying that he had gone to visit a newly ordained priest, and when he came back, he was preaching, and he said that the newly ordained priest said this. He said, "Father or Monsignor, you never told us how busy it was going to be." At which point I wanted to raise my hand and say, actually, y'all tell us that all the time. He said, you never told us how busy it was going to be, but you also never told us how good it was going to be. And so if I want to say for the bad things that I didn't sign up for this, then it also means saying for all of the good things, I didn't sign up for this. Because in some way, just like I didn't know how difficult it would be, I had no idea how good being a priest would be. I've told people often that if I could go back in my mind to college Patrick and think about the perfect life I could imagine, marry the girl that I liked and have the kids that I wanted and get the job I wanted to do, there is no way that I could imagine being as happy as I am as a priest. It's not possible. And even in the seminary, thinking about being a priest, I could not imagine it bringing me the joy that I've experienced in the midst of the difficulties over these last 9 years. And that goes for the Christian life in general. And it's a difficult life, but it's a very good and beautiful life. So I think that a way that my reflection today could be summed up, which hopefully clues you into the fact that we're getting close to the end, is St. Paul's letter to the Romans. He says, where sin increased, grace overflowed all the more. And in place of sin, you could put difficulties or trials or hardships or whatever it might be. Where those increase, grace has overflowed all the more. That as life goes on and as I become older and older, as you constantly remind me, it gets harder, but it gets even better. And God continues to shower his grace upon me. And so I have to remember that I signed up for the difficulties, but I also have to remember that in doing so I signed up for the good times. And I'll run through them quickly for you. Obviously not all of them, because, yeah. So first, I signed up. It's like my life is like a story. You can write it if you want. So I came to UL. I came to Wisdom. I sat not in these exact pews because they replaced them in 2006 or something, but I sat in the pews that were here that are actually now in Father Champine's chapel in St. Martinville. And I encountered the Lord in a profound way. And in many ways, I heard the call to the priesthood here. In the office that is currently my office, I talked to Father Chester Arsenault, who is the first priest in this diocese that I talked to, about the possibility of becoming a priest. And now I get to talk to people about how terrified they are about the possibility of God calling them to be a priest or a sister. This was a great meeting. He had a drumstick. He gets stressed. He had this stress stick, and he was smacking himself on the neck. Not a great poster for vocations, but it worked, right? And so after the encounters that I had here as a student, to be able to come back as a priest for my first assignment and minister to people like you who are going through exactly what I went through as a student was an unbelievable grace. And then when I thought it couldn't get any better, I got assigned to the cathedral after I left here, which when people asked me where I was going for my next assignment, I would say, I don't know, but I'm not going to cathedral because that was my parish where I was sponsored. And then the bishop called and said, hey, you're going to go to cathedral. And I said, thanks for making me a liar. But I went to cathedral. And I got to be with Father Chester, who talked to me in that office while beating his neck with a stress stick. And I got to minister to the people of the cathedral with him. And I got to go on bad days, which was often, to the school. And I got to talk to the students in their classes. And I had no idea what kind of an impact that made until Father Schumacher told me repeatedly how they continue to talk about me. And I don't even think it was in a bad way. They talk about my time there and the impact that I had on the church and the school. And I got to sit across the table from the great Monsignor Mouton almost every day of the week and have lunch with him and draw from his 60-plus years of priestly experience and learn how to be a priest. I could have died and it would have been great, but I didn't. I'm still here. And I got assigned as full-time vocation director for a year. And I got to take this joy that was in my heart from being a priest, and I got to go all over the diocese and talk to men and women about asking the Lord if he was calling them to be a priest or consecrated or religious. And I got to share with them my experience of being a priest and encourage them in that call if in fact the Lord was calling them. And then I got to go to Church Point. And this, if you look at the X's and O's, right, this assignment made absolutely no sense. It made no sense. But I went there because the bishop asked me to. And in a lot of ways, I grew there more than any other assignment. Because it was the first time I was a pastor. And I remember Father Abity telling me about becoming a pastor. He's like, man, it's so great. And, oh, it's so wonderful. It's the best. And I was like, oh, come on. Like, I love being a priest. How could it be that much better than what I'm doing now? And I don't know how to explain it, but it is better. And so I got to pastor, shepherd the people of Church Point for 2 very, very glorious years. And then the bishop called, and he said, what I already told you, come to Wisdom. And I said, okay. And I got to meet not all of you, because I knew some of you before, but I got to meet a bunch of you. And I got to have a different relationship with those I already knew, because I then became your pastor. And I think the time here is summed up in a question or a statement that someone made to me. They said, wow, a college campus, that must be incredibly thankless work. I said, actually, I get tired of hearing them thank me. That's exaggeration. They are so incredibly grateful. They're so involved in their faith. They are so hungry for the Lord that it makes it possible, and sometimes, I dare say, easy to do the work that I'm called to do. And so, laying down on the cathedral floor, I promised to pour out my life for Christ and his church. To, in the words of the first reading, to sow bountifully in the vineyard of the Lord. And God has been incredibly, incredibly good to me, because even though I didn't understand fully what I was signing up for, it has surpassed any expectation I could have possibly had. And the Lord has not only repaid me bountifully with his life and his joy, but he's even already allowed me to see some of the bountiful fruits that he is bringing about because of my ministry.